My name is Savannah Brooks, and I'm 34 years old. It was Christmas dinner when my mom lifted her glass, looked around the table at every cousin and aunt she could find, and announced that my sister had just bought her dream house. Then she turned to me with that soft, practiced smile and said the room was still waiting on me. My sister smirked over her wine and asked when I was finally going to settle down. Everyone looked at me like I was the family's unfinished chore. What none of them knew was that I'd already built an entire life they'd never bothered to visit, and that the plain craft envelope in my coat pocket held the one number my mother had spent 12 years hoping no one would ever say out loud. Welcome back to Red Wine Revenge, where the quietest person at the table is usually the one holding the truth, and where the people who spent years underestimating her finally have to hear it out loud. If stories about earned dignity and long overdue boundaries are what brought you here, drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss the moment the whole table goes silent. Now, let me take you back to how it started. The morning of that dinner started the way all my good mornings start at 4:30 in a kitchen that smells like yeast and cold air. I own a place called Copper Creek Bakery and Farm, a low stone building at the end of a gravel road with 30 acres of orchard behind it. I bake before the sun comes up because bread doesn't care how tired you are. And I've always liked things that don't need managing, only tending. My husband, Wyatt, was already out in the barn fixing a shelf bracket that had worked itself loose, and I could hear the tap of his hammer under the hum of the proofing oven. We had 11 wholesale orders to fill and a farmer's market stall to load by 7. None of it was glamorous. All of it was mine, down to the last penny and the last board. Somewhere along the way, I'd learned a quiet trick that changed my whole life. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. It saved me a lot of breath. It also, I would come to realize, cost me something I didn't see until much later. Because silence is a kind of permission, and I'd been handing it out for years. My family thought I sold muffins at a card table on weekends. They thought I was drifting, unmarried, unserious. The daughter who took the scenic route straight into a ditch. I let them think it. What I never figured out, standing in that warm kitchen with flour on my hands, was why I kept the best parts of my life hidden from the people who were supposed to want to see them. The invitation came the way my mother's invitations always came, wrapped in warmth with a hook inside it. She called on a Tuesday, her voice bright as a bell. The whole family's coming for Christmas, honey. Your sister has some big news, and it just wouldn't feel complete without you there. I stood by the walk-in cooler and let the silence stretch a second too long, because I already knew what big news meant. It meant a stage, and it meant I'd be furniture on it. I'll think about it, I said. Oh, don't be like that, she said. Family is family. When I hung up, Wyatt was leaning in the doorway with a coffee in each hand, and he'd heard enough. You don't have to go, he said. He handed me a mug and waited the way he does without pushing. I know, I said. But if I don't, she gets to tell the room I couldn't be bothered. If I do, she gets to tell the room I'm a mess. There's no version where I win by not showing up. Wyatt nodded slowly. Then go if you want, he said. Just don't hand them a knife. I thought about that for the rest of the day. I could go and still keep the door to my real life closed. I could smile, eat the ham, admire the news, and drive home to my own bed. I didn't need them to see me. I'd made peace with that years ago. So I said yes. And I told myself it would be the same as always. A couple of hours of being the cautionary tale, then quiet. I had no idea that this year the script was about to break in my hands. That dinner didn't come from nowhere. It came from a story my family had been telling about me for a lot longer than that Tuesday phone call. I was the second daughter, 3 years behind my sister Chloe. And somewhere in the first decade of my life, the family settled on a story about me. Chloe was the sensible one. I was the dreamer, which in my mother's mouth was never a compliment. When I was 20 and told my parents I wanted to open a bakery, my mother laughed. Not cruelly, just, certainly. The way you laugh at a child who says she wants to be a mermaid. That's a hobby, sweetheart, she said, not a future. My father folded his napkin and said nothing, which was his whole personality when it came to my mother. Chloe went to state college, married a man named Lucas with a nice title at a nicer firm, and did everything in the order my mother had drawn up. I went to work at a farm stand for $8 an hour and learned how to make pie crust that people drove 40 minutes for. What I noticed even then was that money in our family always flowed one direction. There was cash for Chloe's textbooks and Chloe's wedding and Chloe's first apartment deposit. For me, there was advice, plenty of it, and a warm reminder that I'd made my own bed. I stopped asking for help while I was still young. I told myself it was pride. Looking back, it was survival, because asking and being refused had started to feel like paying to be reminded of my place. So I built quietly, one early morning at a time, and I let my mother keep her tidy little story. I just didn't know yet how expensive that story had already gotten. The last time I ever asked my mother for anything, I was 23 and I had done my homework. I'd found a small storefront in town, empty for a year, cheap because the roof needed work. I'd written a real plan with numbers, projected costs, a repayment schedule I'd checked 3 times. The bank would lend to me, but only with a cosigner because I was young and my credit was thin. So I sat at my mother's kitchen table and laid it all out, clean and careful. The way you present something you've bled over, she read it. She actually read it, which gave me hope for about 90 seconds. Then she slid the folder back across the table and folded her hands. "We can only afford to believe in one of you," she said. That was it. That was the whole answer. Not "we can't afford it," not "the numbers scare me," not "let me talk to your father." "We can only afford to believe in one of you. I remember thee." Clock ticking. I remember the smell of her coffee. I remember deciding in that kitchen that I would never again put my dreams in a room where they could be priced and rejected. I didn't argue. Arguing would have meant I still thought the verdict was up for appeal. Instead, I took a microloan from a nonprofit lender at a worse rate, and I picked up night shifts cleaning offices to make the payments. I signed that lease alone, and every single time the work got hard over the next decade, her sentence played in my head like a song I couldn't turn off. "We can only afford to believe in one of you." For years, I thought it was just cruelty. It turned out to be an accounting decision. There was exactly one person in my family who never made me feel like a bad investment, and that was my grandmother, Rose. She was my father's mother, a wiry woman with a garden that fed half her street, and she had opinions about everything except my choices, which she simply trusted. The first week I ran my little farm stand, she drove out in her ancient sedan, bought the first loaf of bread I ever sold, and paid me $1 more than I asked because she said I'd undercharged. Then she sat on an overturned crate and watched me work for an hour without saying much. When she stood up to leave, she put her dry, warm hand on my cheek and gave me the only business advice I've ever actually kept. "Build it quiet, honey," she said. "Loud people need an audience. Builders just need mornings." I didn't fully understand it then. I understood it later. Every time I watched my sister perform her life for a crowd while I got up before dawn and simply did mine. Rose died 4 years ago in her sleep in the house she'd paid off on a bookkeeper's salary. She didn't leave me money and I never wanted any. What she left me was that sentence and a way of seeing that I couldn't unlearn. At her funeral, my mother cried the loudest and stood closest to the front. And I remember thinking that Rose would have found that about right. I drove home that night to the farmhouse. I was still fixing up, sat on the porch steps in the dark, and told the quiet that I'd keep building. I just didn't know how much longer I'd keep doing it in secret, or what it was quietly costing the people I loved. Chloe's wedding 11 years ago is the clearest picture I have of how our family did math. She married Lucas in a rented hall with a chandelier, 300 guests, and a cake that cost more than my first 3 months of rent combined. My mother planned it like a coronation and paid for most of it without ever once using the word budget. I was a bridesmaid in a dress I couldn't really afford, and I stood at the front and watched my mother glow like she'd finally gotten the daughter the universe owed her. Don't misunderstand me. I loved my sister then. In the complicated way, you love someone who has always been handed the last good chair before you walk in the room. Chloe wasn't a monster. She was just a person who had never been told no. And people like that develop a kind of blindness, a genuine inability to see the scale they're standing on. Over the years, she got comfortable taking a loan here that never got mentioned again. A vacation my parents just wanted to treat them to. And she got comfortable performing, too. Narrating her life in updates designed to be admired. So, when my mother said Chloe had big news for Christmas, I could already picture it. The photos passed around the table, the gasps, the toast. I figured it was the house. Chloe had been hinting online for weeks about manifesting our forever home, which is the kind of phrase that makes me want to go bake something. What I couldn't have guessed driving toward that dinner was that the dream house wasn't the flex it looked like. It was a debt with a bow on it, and I was about to find out exactly whose name held the ribbon. By the week of Christmas, I had a life I was genuinely proud of, and almost no one in my family had seen a square foot of it. I owned my building outright. I owned the farmhouse and the 30 acres with the last note paid off the previous spring. I had 6 employees, a wholesale contract with 2 regional grocers, and a marriage to a man who fixed things instead of breaking them. On paper, I was the most stable person in my family. In my family's story, I was the one who never landed. I want to be honest about my part in that because I've thought about it a lot. I didn't hide my life out of shame. I hid it because every time I'd let them close, they'd found a way to make me smaller. And after a while, it was easier to just close the door and keep it shut. That was my weakness, if you want to name it. Not that I trusted them too much, but that I'd stopped trusting them at all and called it peace. So I made my plan for the dinner the way I make everything, carefully. I'd bring 2 pies. I'd smile. I'd admire the news. I would not perform my success because performing is my sister's language, not mine. And I had nothing to prove to a room that had already graded me. One evening, one smile, then home. That was the whole strategy. What I didn't know, packing those pies into the truck, was that my father had already driven out to my bakery 2 days earlier and left something on my counter, an envelope I hadn't opened yet. And that inside, it was the reason the piece I'd built was about to end, whether I wanted it to or not. People love a story where someone gets rich overnight, and mine is not that story. Mine took 12 years, and most of them were boring, which is the part nobody films. The first years were the farm stand, then the storefront I signed for a loan at 23, the one with the bad roof I patched myself between customers. I lived above it for a while in 2 rooms that smelled permanently of cinnamon, and I put every extra dollar back into the business instead of into a life that looked like anything. When I was 28, I bought the farmhouse and the acreage from an old couple who were retiring to Arizona at a price that only made sense because the place was falling down. I fixed it in the order I could afford, 1 room, a winter, and I grew the orchard from bare root saplings that took years to fruit. The wholesale contracts came slowly, 1 grocer at a time, each one requiring me to prove I could deliver on schedule for months before they'd trust me with a real order. There were seasons I didn't take a paycheck. There was a hailstorm that flattened a summer's crop and a walk-in that died on the hottest weekend of the year. I kept clean books because Grandma Rose had been a bookkeeper and I'd inherited her belief that numbers don't lie if you don't ask them to. And the previous spring, in the plainest moment of my adult life, I'd sat at my kitchen table and paid off the last loan on the property. No party, no post. I just wrote the check, mailed it, and went back to work. That was the fortune my family never saw because I'd never once invited them to look. Wyatt came into my life the way most. Good things did, through work. He is a carpenter, and I hired him 4 years ago to reframe the sagging roof on the barn. He showed up on time, did what he said he'd do, charged me fairly, and noticed the things I noticed, which is rarer than it sounds. We got married in my backyard 2 summers ago under the oldest apple tree on the property with 9 people there. A judge who was also a regular customer. 2 of my employees, Wyatt's brother and his wife, my friend Renee, who'd loaned me a mixer in year 2, and never let me forget it. And that was it. I didn't invite my family. I've been asked why more than once since then, and the honest answer isn't dramatic. I didn't hide Wyatt from anyone. I just stopped inviting people to laugh. I knew exactly how the news would land in my mother's kitchen. The raised eyebrow, the well, isn't that sudden? The questions about what Wyatt did that were really questions about what Wyatt earned. I knew Chloe would ask if it was even a real wedding without a hall. I had built 1 clean, happy thing, and I could not stomach the thought of handing it over to be appraised and found wanting like everything else. So I kept it. We stood under the tree. We ate a pie I'd baked that morning instead of a cake. And it was the best day of my life precisely because no one in it had ever once made me feel like a long shot. My family found out I was married months later through a cousin. My mother's response relayed to me was that she was hurt not to be included. She'd never asked to be. Chloe called me the week before Christmas, which she never does, and the strangeness of it put me on alert before she'd finished saying hello. She was breezy, chatty, asking how I'd been, which she also never does. Then she got to it gently. The way you circle something, you don't want to look like you're grabbing. So, how's the little bakery doing these days? She asked. Still busy. You must clear a decent bit around the holidays. I gave her nothing real, just we keep busy, and stirred thee. Soup on my stove while she fished. It's just so smart what you do. She went on in a voice that had never once called it smart before. Steady, no big overhead like some people have. She laughed a little on that last part, and something in it snagged. My sister had never in her life asked a curious question about my business. She asked about it now, the way you check a couch cushion for change. I didn't understand the shape of it yet, but I understood the temperature. Somebody was taking my measure. When I hung up, I stood in my kitchen and turned it over. Steady. No big overhead. You must clear a decent bit. Those weren't the words of a sister catching up. They were the words of someone doing math about me for the first time in years. And people in my family only did math about you when they wanted something. I didn't call Wyatt in from the barn to tell him. I just made a note of it, the way you note a hairline crack in a beam. Nothing to act on yet, something to watch. And then the invitations kept coming, warmer by the day, and I started to feel like I was being set up for something I couldn't quite see the edges of. My mother's tone shifted that same week, and I'd known her long enough to read a shift like weather. She called again, unprompted, and this time she was sweet in a way that set my teeth on edge. You should bring some of your baking for the table, she said. You always were so good with your hands. I held the phone away from my ear for a second and just looked at it. In 34 years, I could not remember my mother volunteering that I was good at anything without a but attached. Sure, I said. I'll bring a couple of pies. Wonderful, she said. And Savannah, it'll just be so nice to have everyone together. Whole family under one roof, she said. Whole family like it was a favor she was extending to me when for years I'd been the part of the family she edited out of the picture. I hung up and stood there in the flower dust light of my kitchen, and I felt that old animal wariness come up my spine. Praise from my mother wasn't affection. It was a down payment. She was warming me up for something, and the timing lined up too neatly with Chloe's little fishing call to be a coincidence. 2 of them in 1 week, suddenly interested in the daughter they'd spent a decade dismissing. I thought about my grandmother and about the accounts she used to say. Always balance if you're patient. Somebody in my family needed something from me. I didn't know what. But I knew that whatever it was big enough to make my mother compliment my hands, and that scared me more than any insult ever had because insults I understood. It was the sudden kindness I couldn't trust. A day later, my Aunt Carol texted me out of nowhere, and it told me more about my family than any phone call could. So happy you finally found someone, she wrote with a little heart. Your mom says he's very handy. I read it twice. Finally found someone. I'd been married for 2 years. But of course, in the family's telling, I hadn't gotten married. I'd finally found someone. A phrasing that turned a settled fact into a rescue narrative. Poor Savannah saved at last. And there it was, the machine I'd spent years staying out of. They'd been talking about me the whole time behind me, spinning me into whatever shape the story needed. When I was single, I was the daughter who couldn't land a man. Now that I was married, I was the daughter who'd barely scraped, one together. There was no version of me that the gossip couldn't turn into a lesson for the cousins. I typed 3 different replies to Aunt Carol and deleted all of them. I could have set the record straight. Told her I'd been married 2 years to a man I chose in a yard full of apple trees. But I've learned that correcting gossip is like arguing with weather. You just get wet and it keeps raining. So I wrote back, "Thank you, Carol," and left it there. Silence had always been my move. My one. Reliable weapon against a family that turned everything you said into ammunition. What I hadn't reckoned with yet was that silence only protects you until the day it doesn't. until the day staying quiet stops being dignity and starts being consent. That day was closer than I knew. It was in fact 48 hours away, and it would arrive in a plain craft envelope carried by the last person I expected. My father drove out to the bakery 2 days before Christmas, which he had done exactly never in the years I'd owned it. I looked up from the register, and there he was in the doorway in his old canvas coat, holding his hat in both hands like a man at a graveside. Customers moved around him. He didn't seem to see them. "Dad," I said, and I heard the surprise in my own voice. "Is everything okay?" He came to the counter and set a plain craft envelope down on it, sliding it toward me with 2 fingers like it was heavier than paper should be. "You should know what you're walking into," he said. That was all. No preamble, no speech. My father had made a career out of saying nothing in my mother's kitchen. And now here he was saying the truest thing he'd said to me in years in one quiet sentence at my own counter. I wiped my hands on my apron and picked up the envelope. It wasn't sealed. "What is this?" I asked. He looked at me, and for the first time I could remember, his eyes were wet. "It's what your mother didn't want you to see," he said. "I'm tired of watching it, Savannah." I've been tired for a long time. Then he put his hat on, told me he'd see me at dinner, and walked back out to his truck before I could say another word. I stood there in the middle of my own busy shop with a line forming and an envelope in my hand that my hands did not want to open. Whatever was inside it, my father had driven 40 minutes to deliver it in person and couldn't stay to watch me read it. That told me everything about how much it was going to weigh. I waited until closing to open it. I sat in my quiet shop after the last employee left, with the ovens cooling and the winter dark pressing on the windows, and I slid the papers out onto the counter under the one light I'd left on. It was financial paperwork printed at home, the ink a little faint. The first page was a home equity line of credit in my parents' names, drawn against the house I grew up in. The second was a loan document, a co-signer agreement. My mother's signature next to my sister's on, a mortgage for a 5-bedroom house in a subdivision on the good side of town. The third page was a bank statement, and it was the one that stopped my breath. My parents had pulled a large sum out of that equity line the previous spring, and a matching withdrawal had come out of a retirement account the same week, and both had gone, according to the memo lines my father had circled in pencil, toward the down payment on Chloe's dream house. The dates lined up like dominoes. My mother had drained her own. Retirement and mortgaged her paid-off home to make my sister look like she'd arrived. And she'd done it the very same season I mailed the final check on a farm I'd built with no help from anyone. I sat there with those pages under my hands, and my mother's voice came back to me across 11 years, clear as the day she'd said it. "We can only afford to believe in one of you." It had never been about affording it. She'd found plenty to spend. It had only ever been about which of us she'd chosen to spend it on. I sat very still, dry-eyed and steady, no storm in me at all. I folded the papers back into the envelope, slid it into the inside pocket of my coat, and turned off the light. I didn't sleep much that night, but not for the reason you'd think. I wasn't planning revenge. I was arguing with myself about whether to do anything at all because I could keep quiet. I was very good at keeping quiet. I could walk into that dinner, eat the ham, admire the house, drive home, and carry that. Envelope to my grave, and nothing in my comfortable, hard-won life would change. That was the safe move, and I've always been a fan of the safe move. But something had shifted when I read those pages, and it took me until nearly morning to name it. For 12 years, I'd told myself my silence was strength. Reading those numbers, I understood it had also been the thing that let the story keep running. Every time I stayed quiet, my mother got to keep selling the version where she couldn't afford to. Help me, where I was the risk that hadn't paid off, where Chloe was the wise investment. My silence had been signing off on the lie. Wyatt found me at the kitchen table before dawn with cold coffee and the envelope in front of me. He sat down and didn't reach for it. "You don't owe them a scene," he said quietly, "but you don't owe them your silence either." I turned that over for a long time. He was right on both counts. I decided I wouldn't go in swinging. I wouldn't stand up and make a speech or ambush anyone or ruin Christmas on principle. But if they came for me the way they always did, if they put me on the stage to be the family's cautionary tale one more time, then this year I wasn't going to swallow it. This year, if they pushed, I was going to tell the truth. Just once. Just the truth. I know a lot of you have carried a version of this, the family story where you're the cautionary tale and someone else is the trophy. If you've ever built something quietly while people rolled their eyes, this next part is for you. So stay with me. Comment Quiet Builder if that's you and hit subscribe. Christmas morning, I did what I always do when I'm bracing for something. I baked. I made 2 pies, an apple from my own trees, and a bourbon pecan, and the ordinary work of it steadied my hands the way it always has. Wyatt loaded them into the truck while I got dressed, and I stood in front of the mirror longer than I needed to. I wasn't dressing to impress anyone. I was dressing like a woman who owned her own. Building, which, as it happens, looks a lot like a nice sweater and clean boots. I put on my Goodwill coat, and I felt the weight of the envelope settle against my ribs like a stone I'd decided to carry on purpose. Wyatt watched me from the doorway. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm not going over there to win," I told him. And I meant it. I'm going over there to stop losing. He nodded like that made sense, because it did. On the drive across the county, the fields were bare and silver with frost, and I ran the plan through one more time. I would be warm. I would be gracious. I would let my mother have her toast and my sister have her house. I would say nothing about the envelope unless they forced my hand. And I promised myself that if they did force it, I would stay calm. Whatever happened, I would not give my mother the gift of watching me lose my temper, because a loud daughter is a daughter you can dismiss. And I intended never to be dismissed again. We turned onto my parents' street, past the houses strung with lights, and I could see the cars already lining the curb. I took a breath, put the truck in park, and reminded myself that I only needed one sentence. My parents' house was decorated the way it always is at Christmas, tasteful and a little breathless, every surface saying, "We're doing wonderfully," in case anyone was keeping score. The whole crowd was there. Aunt Carol and her husband, 2 sets of cousins, a great uncle parked in the good armchair, and at the center of it all, holding court by the mantle, my sister Chloe and her husband Lucas. There was a stack of glossy photos going around the room, hand to hand, and I didn't have to look to know what they were. The dream house. Chloe spotted me and gave me a little wave with just her fingers. The wave you give the help. Lucas nodded without getting up. My mother swept over, took the pies out of my hands, and turned to steer me into the room by the elbow. "Everyone, Savannah's here," she announced. And then in the same warm breath, she's still figuring things out. But she brought us her little pies. Isn't that sweet? Still figuring things out. 2 years married, 30 acres paid off, and to the whole assembled family, I was introduced as a work in progress with a nice hobby. I felt Wyatt go still beside me, and I put my hand on his arm before he could say a word. "Not yet. Not here." I smiled at the room, said, "Merry Christmas," and let my mother deposit me on the edge of things, like a chair that had been brought up from the basement for extra seating. The photos of the house reached me. I looked at them politely. 5 bedrooms, a kitchen island the size of my truck bed, a staircase built to be descended in front of an audience. I handed them along and I felt the envelope against my ribs, and I waited. The needles started before we even sat down, the way they always did, small enough that objecting to any one of them would make me look sensitive. My mother never quite introduced Wyatt, just gestured at him once and moved on, so that half the room spent the evening unsure who he was. Chloe drifted over with her wine and looked me up and down with a smile that never reached her eyes. "You look well," she said in the tone you'd use on someone recovering from an illness. "Still selling muffins at the market, sweetie?" I said we kept busy. She'd already turned to describe her new kitchen to a cousin, the island, the double ovens, the walk-in pantry, and a guest suite. So, if anyone's ever in a tight spot, there's always a place to land. She said that last part, looking right at me, offering me in front of the family, a spare room for the day. My little life inevitably collapsed. Trevor chimed in about the neighborhood, the good schools, the appreciation on the property, throwing around numbers with the confidence of a man who has never once had to make the payment himself. I took it the way I'd taken it for years, with a small closed smile, sipping my water, saying almost nothing. But this year, the silence felt different in my mouth. This year, I had an envelope against my ribs that made every one of Trevor's confident numbers into a kind of joke because I knew exactly where the real numbers had come from. I watched my mother beam at her golden couple, and I thought about the retirement account and the mortgaged house, and I understood that I was the only person at that party who knew the price of the show I was watching. It made me very calm. Chloe cornered me in the kitchen before dinner, and the mask slipped so fast it almost gave me whiplash. She'd followed me in when I went to check on my pies, and she pulled the swinging door half shut behind her, which is what people do when they're about to say something they don't want witnessed. "So, listen," she said, and the breezy performance was gone, replaced by something tight around the eyes. "Things are a little stretched right now with the house. Trevor's bonus didn't come through, and the mortgage is, well, it's a lot." She laughed, and it came out thin. "Mom mentioned you've actually done pretty well for yourself out there with the bakery." There it was. The fishing call, the sudden compliments, my mother's warm invitations, all of it finally landing on the counter between us. I was thinking, Chloe went on, not quite meeting my eyes. "Maybe you could help us out alone or, invest in the house. Family helps family, right?" I stood there holding a pie server and looked at my sister who had spent 34 years watching our mother refuse me, a co-signature, and who is now asking me to bankroll the very house that refusal had helped pay for. I didn't laugh, though part of me wanted to. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, keeping my voice even. The number she named would have covered my entire first storefront twice over. "It's just temporary," she added quickly until things turn around. I set the pie server down. "I'll think about it," I said, which is what my mother always said to me right before she said no. Chloe's face relaxed, mistaking it for a yes. She had no idea I just decided something, and it wasn't about the money. My mother came into the kitchen a minute later, and the timing was too clean to be an accident. She'd sent Chloe in first to soften me, and now she'd come to close. She picked up a serving spoon, pretended to fuss with the potatoes, and got to it sideways, the way she does everything. "Did your sister talk to you?" she asked lightly. "About the house?" I said she had. My mother nodded, still not looking at me, arranging food that didn't need arranging. "It would mean a lot." She said, "It's the least you could do for your sister. Honestly, she has real responsibilities now. A mortgage, a family to think about. You've only got yourself in the bakery. You've only got yourself." As if the life I'd built was a smaller thing than the debt Chloe had bought. As if 30 acres and a marriage and 6 people's paychecks were a bachelorette's hobby. Next to my sister's granite countertops. And underneath it, unmistakable, was the old sentence, wearing a new coat. 11 years ago, it had been, "We can only afford to believe in one of you." Tonight, it was the least you could do for your sister. Same accounting, same daughter on the losing side of the ledger. Except now that I had quietly become solvent, I was suddenly useful. My mother finally looked up at me, and her eyes had that soft, expectant warmth she saved for the moment she was sure. She'd already won. "Family takes care of family, Savannah," she said. I looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," I said quietly. "I've noticed how that works in this family." Something flickered across her face. A first small crack of uncertainty. There and gone. She didn't know what I meant yet. She was about to. I asked Chloe and my mother to step out onto the back porch with me for a second, away from the crowd, because whatever else I am, I'm not cruel, and I wanted to give them the chance to hear my no in private first. The cold hit us as I pulled the door shut. "I'm not going to lend you the money," I said. No anger, no lecture, just the fact laid down clean the way I'd learned to lay down numbers. Chloe's face crumpled into something between shock and offense. "Are you serious?" "We're family." "We are," I agreed, "and I hope the house works out. But I'm not going to prop up a payment. I can't afford to lose on a property I have nothing to do with. And I think you already know that's the right call. Or you wouldn't have asked me in a kitchen with the door half shut." My mother's warmth vanished like a light switched off. "After everything this family has done for you," she started, and I almost admired the nerve of it. But her next words were the ones that mattered. She stepped close, lowered her voice, and said, "Don't you dare make a scene about this at the table. Not tonight. Not in front of everyone. And there it was, the tell. My mother wasn't afraid of no. She was afraid of what I might say if I stopped being quiet, afraid of a scene, which meant she knew somewhere under all that performance that there was a scene to be made. She knew what I might have. I looked at her in the porch light, this woman who had spent a lifetime managing the family story, and I understood that she was, for the first time I could remember, genuinely afraid of me. We went back inside and everyone sat down to eat. And for a little while, it was almost a normal Christmas dinner if you didn't know what was humming under the table. The ham came out and the potatoes and my 2 pies were set on the sideboard for later like polite afterthoughts. Wyatt found my hand under the tablecloth and held it, and I was glad of him. I could feel my mother watching me from the head of the table. Could feel her calculating, wondering if her warning on the porch had landed, if I'd stay in my lane. Chloe had recovered her performance and was telling a cousin about the crown molding. Trevor was, carving. The great uncle was asleep in his chair with a plate on his knees. It looked from the outside like a family. I ate a little. I said, "Please and thank you." I complimented the ham, which was genuinely good because my mother has always been able to cook whatever else is true about her. And the whole time I kept my hand near my coat, which I draped over the back of my chair, and I felt the envelope in it, and I waited because I had decided one thing on that porch. I wasn't going to start anything. I would not be the one to pick up the knife. But if my mother stood up and did what she always did, if she put me on the stage one more time to make my sister shine, then I was done swallowing it. And everyone in that room was going to hear something true. My mother reached for her wine glass. She tapped it lightly with her fork, and the table went quiet, and she rose to make her toast. I sat down my own fork and folded my hands. My mother stood at the head of the table with her glass raised and her whole face lit up, and she gave the toast she'd clearly been rehearsing all week. I just want to say, she began, "How blessed I am to have my family all together, and I have some wonderful news to share." She paused for effect, the way she always does. "Your sister and Lucas have just bought their dream house." The table erupted right on cue. Aunt Carol clapped. The cousins made the sounds people make. Chloe pressed a hand to her chest and did her modest little laugh, and Lucas lifted his glass like a man, accepting an award he'd bought himself. My mother beamed down the length of the table, drinking in every second of it. And then, because one triumph is never enough for her, she turned the spotlight where she always turned it. She looked at me warm and pitying, and she said, "And of course, we're all still waiting on our Savannah to figure out her life." A few uncomfortable chuckles, and then Chloe, flushed with wine and applause, twisted the knife with a smile, leaning toward me down the table so the whole room could enjoy it. So she said sweetly, "When are you finally going to settle down?" There it was. The question they had been asking me in one form or another for a decade, delivered this time as the punchline to my sister's victory lap in front of every relative I had. Every face at that table turned toward me, some amused, some embarrassed, all of them waiting to watch me shrink the way I always did. I felt Wyatt's hand tighten on mine. I felt the envelope against the back of my chair. And I felt for the first time in years completely calm. I set my glass down gently so it wouldn't make a sound, and I smiled at my sister. A real smile, because the moment had finally come and I found I wasn't afraid of it. "I already did," I said. The table waited, not understanding yet. I already settled down. I went on, my voice quiet, and even the voice I use when I'm telling a customer the price, and I know it's fair. I just didn't invite people who never believed in me. For a second, nobody moved. Then the questions started, small and confused, and I answered them plainly, one at a time, without raising my voice. "This is my husband, Wyatt," I said, and I put my hand on his shoulder. "We've been married 2 years. We got married under the apple tree behind my farmhouse." My mother's smile had frozen. "Your farmhouse," she repeated. "My farmhouse," I said. 30 acres and a house I bought when I was 28 and finished paying off last spring. I own the bakery building 2 outright. I have 6 employees and contracts with 2 grocery chains. I wasn't bragging. I was reciting flat and factual the way you read a deed. I've been married for 2 years and running a business for 12, and this family introduced me tonight as someone still figuring things out. The room had gone completely silent now. That specific silence that falls when a story everyone believed turns out to be wrong. Aunt Carol's fork was suspended over her plate. The cousins were looking at their laps. Chloe's mouth had opened and closed twice without producing anything. My mother stood at the head of the table, glass still in her hand, staring at me as if I'd started speaking a language she didn't know I could speak. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't cried. I'd simply told the truth. And in a family built on a careful story, the truth landed like a dropped plate. My mother recovered the way a fire recovers when you open a door. Her face went from white to red, and she set her glass down hard enough to slush wine onto the tablecloth. "How dare you," she said, and her voice was already climbing. "How dare you turn your sister's night into this, into some performance about yourself?" The irony of the word performance coming from her at her own carefully staged toast was almost too much. But I said nothing. "You've always been like this." She went on louder now, gesturing with a shaking hand while the relatives sat frozen, selfish, cold. "You disappear for years. You don't invite your own mother to your wedding. And then you show up here to embarrass this family and make everyone feel small. Do you have any idea what you've done tonight?" She was crying now. The fast, furious tears I'd seen my whole life. The ones that always arrived precisely when she was losing control of a room and needed to take it back. "After everything your father and I have done for you," she said, and her voice broke on the word done. "This is how you repay us." I let her go. I didn't interrupt, didn't defend myself, didn't match a single decibel of it, because something had finally come clear to me that I wish I'd understood at 23. The louder she got, the smaller her argument became, and every person at that table could see it. This was the power inversion I hadn't known I was waiting for. For 34 years, my mother had been the calm one, and I'd been the disappointment squirming under her verdict. Now, she was the one coming apart at the head of the table, and I was the one sitting still with my hands folded, and there was nothing she could say that would put the room back the way it had been. "After everything you've done for me," I repeated softly when she finally ran out of air. "Let's talk about that." I reached back into my coat, took out the envelope, and set it on the table in front of me, unopened, where everyone could see it. I didn't wave it around. I just laid it down the way you set down a card you've been holding all night. "Mom," I said, "for 12 years, you've told this family a story that you couldn't afford to help me. That Chloe was the sensible one, and I was the risk. When I was 23, I brought you a business plan and asked you to co-sign a loan, and you told me, and I have never forgotten the words, that you could only afford to believe in one of us." A few of the relatives shifted. Aunt Carol looked at my mother. "I never asked you for another thing." I went on. "I built everything I have without a dollar from this family." And I would have kept quiet about all of it tonight, the way I always have, except that Chloe asked me in the kitchen an hour ago to bail out her mortgage, and you followed her in to tell me it was the least I could do. My mother had gone very still. "So, I think the family should know," I said, and I put 2 fingers on the envelope. "What's actually inside your daughter's dream house?" I told them. I told them about the home equity line drawn against my parents' paid-off home. I told them about the retirement account drained the same week and the co-signature on Chloe's mortgage. I told them the down payment on that 5-bedroom house had come out of my mother's retirement and my father's future. The same spring, I quietly mailed the last check on a farm I'd built with my own 2 hands. "You always had the money," I said, my voice never rising. "You just spent it on the daughter you'd already decided to believe in." Chloe made a small sound. Lucas set down his fork. The silence that followed had weight, and it was not on my side of the table by accident. "Here's the part I want you to hear, because it's the part I'm proudest of." I did not gloat. I had the whole table. I had the truth. I had my mother speechless for the first time in living memory, and I felt no pull at all to twist it. Winning that way would have made me a smaller version of them, and I'd worked too hard to become someone else. So I folded my hands on the table and I spoke gently to the whole room and to no one in particular. "I'm not saying this to collect a debt," I said. "Nobody in this family owes me money. I'm saying it because I'm done paying in silence, and silence is the only thing I've ever actually given you." I turned to Chloe, whose eyes had gone glassy. "I'm not going to fund the house," I said. "But if you want real help, I'll sit down with you and look at the actual numbers, honestly, without Mom in the room, and figure out whether it's even a house you can keep. That's help. Writing a check to keep a lie standing isn't. Then I looked at my mother. I didn't. Come here tonight to hurt you, I said, and I meant it. I came to stop being the story you tell to make everyone else feel chosen. I'm not that person. I never was. I just let you say I was. And that's on me. And it stops now. My mother opened her mouth, and for one strange second, I thought an actual apology might come out, the first of my life. Instead, she said in a wounded whisper that I'd ruined Christmas, that I'd always been jealous of my sister, that she didn't know where she'd gone. Wrong with me. I nodded slowly. It was at least honest. It was exactly who she was. I stood up. Not fast, not dramatic, just the way you rise when you finished a meal and it's time to go. Wyatt stood with me. I looked down the table at all of them, the frozen cousins, my crying mother, my sister staring at her plate, Trevor pretending to be very interested in the tablecloth, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, just quiet. My father caught my eye from his end of the table, and he gave me the smallest nod, and I understood that whatever it had cost him to drive that envelope out to my shop, he did not regret it. I nodded back. That was the whole conversation, and it said more than the last 10 years of dinners. The pies are on the sideboard, I said to the room evenly. The apples from my own trees. Help yourselves. I picked up my coat, the envelope tucked safely back inside it, and I put my hand on Wyatt's arm. At the doorway, I stopped and turned because there was one more thing I wanted to leave behind, and I wanted to leave it gently. Merry Christmas, I said, and I looked at my mother when I said it. I mean that. I really do. Then we walked out into the cold, and the door closed behind us on a silence I had waited half my life to hear, and I did not slow down to listen to whatever came next. For once, what they said about me after I left was none of my business. The days after Christmas were quieter than I expected and stranger. Aunt Carol called first 2 days later, and to my surprise, she apologized. She said she'd spent years hearing one side of me and had never once thought to ask for the other, and that she was ashamed of it. She asked if she could come see the farm. I said yes. 2 of my cousins drove out that week and bought bread like it was any other shop, except they lingered and looked around at what I'd built, and I could see them quietly rewriting the story they'd been told. Word came secondhand that Chloe and Lucas had put the dream house back on the market before spring because the numbers never had worked and no amount of my mother's retirement was going to make them. I felt no joy in it. It was just gravity doing what gravity does to a thing built on a bluff. My own life didn't change at all, which was the point. The oven still needed lighting at 4:30. The orchard still needed pruning. Wyatt still fixed things that came loose. The only difference was that I no longer carried the family's story around in my chest like a stone. I'd set it down on that table and I'd left it there, and the not carrying of it felt like putting down a weight I'd forgotten was heavy. My father came out to the farm in January alone on a gray afternoon. He stood in my kitchen turning his hat in his hands again, and he told me the thing he'd never managed to say in 34 years. I watched her do it your whole life, he said, and I told myself it wasn't my place. That was cowardice, Savannah. I should have stood up for you a long time ago. I let him say it. Then I poured him coffee and told him the truth right back. I'm glad you finally did, I said, and I forgive you. But an apology opens a door. It doesn't move you back in. We start from here, slow. He nodded like a man who understood he was getting more than he'd earned. And he stayed for an hour, and it was the best hour we'd had in years. My mother took a different road. She sent long messages about how hurt she was, how I'd humiliated her, how the family was fractured now, and it was my doing. She got 2 cousins to call on her behalf. I read the messages, and I didn't fight them. I just stopped, explaining myself the way I always had, except this time the silence wasn't hiding anything. It was a boundary. There's a difference. And I finally knew it. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from my story, it's this. The people who never bet on you don't get to cash in on the life you built without them. And walking out of a room with your name, still your own, is the only trophy that never loses its value. I spent 12 years thinking my silence was strength when really it was just the quietest way to agree with people who were wrong about me. The day I stopped agreeing, I didn't get louder. I just finally got free. That's my story. One envelope, one quiet answer, and a table that finally had to hear the truth. If you've ever been your family's long shot, let this be your reminder. Build it quiet. Keep your books clean and let the truth do the talking when the moment comes. If this reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Thank you for being here. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next.